The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. We are going to get started right at 9 a.m., so we've got about 5 more minutes. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Grant Administration Training for Targeted Runoff Management Grantees, sponsored by the DNR and UW-Madison Division of Extension. I'm Whitney Presby. I'm a natural resources educator based out of Green Bay. I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle Scarpace, who is also a natural resource educator based out of Madison. And I'd like to welcome Corinne Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager, who is going to be presenting today, and Joanna Griffin, the Runoff Management Grants Coordinator, who will be helping field some questions. UW Extension has partnered with the DNR for more than 9 years, bringing relevant information to a variety of natural resource, municipal, and other local government professionals, and we are happy to be helping out with today's webinar. Just going to go over a few of the webinar logistics. So your control panel, you can hide or expand that by clicking on the orange box in the upper left-hand corner. For audio, if you're joining us by computer, you can click on the audio. If you have any issues with your connection or for whatever reason you are not being able to hear the webinar, you can click on the phone call option and you have the option to call in using a landline or cell phone following the information below. If you run into any issues with the technology, please feel free to send us a question under the question box. Just click on the drop down and enter your question there. We will also be taking questions periodically throughout the webinar. So if you have questions on the content, please send them our way. If they are applicable to the group as a whole, we will be answering them throughout the webinar. If they are more specific to your project, we will follow up individually. Webinars are recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube, and we will be sharing that link out with you in the coming days. With that, I am going to turn it over to Corinne.
All right, thank you, Whitney. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. As Whitney mentioned, I am Corinne Johnson, and I'm the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager. Some of you may remember me in my previous role as the Nonpoint Source Program Coordinator in the Runoff Management Program. Since November of 2019, I have now been serving as the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager for Targeted Runoff Management, Notice of Discharge, and Urban Nonpoint Source Grants. So at this point, I just want to congratulate everybody again that you've been awarded a TRM grant, or TRM, TRM grant for short. I'm excited to be able to share information with you today about how to administer your grant through its life cycle. And today we'll focus on providing answers to some frequently asked questions, provide you with some tips to avoid common errors and problems before they arise, and really try to prevent any delays ultimately with processing your reimbursement requests. So now that you've been awarded a grant, we want to go through the grant process and make you aware of the key steps that everybody needs to follow in order to administer your grant. So we'll be reviewing each of these steps: the grant agreement, cost share agreement approval, the reimbursement request, amendments and variances, and the final report and letter of compliance. And again, as Whitney mentioned, we are recording the webinar, so this will be available for you to reference back to if you need it. It's really our goal to try to make the grant administration process as easy as possible to navigate. So the first step in the grant administration process is the grant agreement or grant award, and all of you have received, signed, and returned your grant award document, which is fantastic. If you haven't done so already, I do encourage you to read your grant document thoroughly. Reading the fine print is always important, and it's critical because that document serves as the foundation for your grant implementation and ultimately your funding eligibility. And should you have any additional questions beyond today's presentation, we have 8 regional Nonpoint Source coordinators in the state, along with staff here in Madison to help you out. Your regional Nonpoint coordinator is your primary point of contact for your project. I'm sure those of you that applied for grants and have working experience with working with each of these regional Nonpoint coordinators in your particular area, they are supported by staff, Madison staff, as needed. So just a reminder, take note of who your Nonpoint coordinator is based on your county location in the state. So next up in the webinar, we're going to review the cost share agreement approval process. And in this section, we'll review the procedures to fill out the cost share agreement form, which is DNR form 3400-069, and we'll provide some examples and helpful hints. So what is a cost share agreement? The cost share agreement is an agreement between you, the grantee, and the cost share recipient, which lists the best management practices, or BMPs, that you're planning to have that cost share recipient implement, or hoping that they're going to implement. And it establishes the conditions and considerations under which that recipient agrees to install the practices listed. The cost share agreement may be used as an offer of cost sharing in accordance with NR 151 for the Ag Performance Standards, and also NR 243.24 for notices of discharge or notices of intent to issue a notice of discharge. When is a cost share agreement required? According to NR 153, essentially a cost share agreement is needed for BMPs to be eligible for cost sharing. So the cost share agreement needs to be signed by the cost share provider, you, the county, and the cost share recipient before BMP installation is initiated. So in accordance with NR 153, the grantee in certain situations must get DNR approval from the DNR Regional Nonpoint Service Coordinator prior to executing the agreement. And the DNR TRM grant website provides the following cost share agreement related forms: the actual agreement, the cost share agreement amendment form, the satisfaction of a cost share agreement, and the release of a cost share agreement form. For the purpose of today's webinar, we're going to solely be reviewing the actual cost share agreement form 3400-069 only. If you need to do an amendment or a satisfaction or release from a cost share agreement, I would ask that you please contact your regional Nonpoint service coordinator for further assistance in filling out those forms. So the grantee ultimately must submit a draft cost share agreement and obtain DNR approval when that cost share agreement amount, including any amendments, exceeds $50,000 in state share. The Regional Nonpoint Service Coordinator will review the cost share agreement to ensure the following requirements are met. First, the CSA is drafted on the most up-to-date version of the form, and you always want to refer to the TRM grant website for the latest version. And then also they'll be looking to see that the state cost shared BMPs included in the cost share agreement are consistent with the grant agreement. If additional BMPs are needed that weren't in the grant agreement, then a grant amendment request will be required, and we'll review this later on in the webinar. So again, there's an additional step in the cost share agreement process that involves recording the cost share agreement on the deed for the applicable property. So in accordance again with NR 153.22, the grantee must record the cost share agreement and its amendments in the Office of the Register of Deeds if the total agreement amount exceeds $14,000, or if that cost share agreement includes a riparian buffer or a waterway system. A cost share agreement may be exempt from the recording requirement if the agreement only contains cropping practices. And I just want to point out too that the recording fees are an eligible cost for reimbursement. So when you fill out your reimbursement form, you're going to use BMP code R115 to seek reimbursement for those recording fees. So just to review, the process flow for the cost share agreement starts with the grantee sending the draft cost share agreement to the Regional Nonpoint Service Coordinator for review and approval when that total state share amount exceeds $50,000. The Regional Nonpoint Coordinator will provide their edits or approve the cost share agreement. Then the grantee reviews the approved CSA, and both the grantee and landowner sign the cost share agreement. And if the cost share agreement exceeds $14,000 in total cost for the BMPs, then the CSA will need to be recorded with the Register of Deeds. Once that is done, the grantee then sends the final signed and recorded cost share agreement to the regional coordinator. Or if the cost share agreement only has cropping practices, or if the cost share agreement does not exceed $14,000 in the total cost for the BMPs, then the cost share agreement doesn't need to be recorded, and the final signed copy is sent to the regional non-point source coordinator. And something to keep in mind too is that when you're submitting your reimbursement request, the final signed and recorded cost share agreement needs to be provided with that reimbursement request. This is usually when we find when we receive the final version of the CSA being submitted to the regional coordinator. However, if you want to submit the final version of the cost share agreement to the DNR before the reimbursement request, that's fine too. So again, just want to remind everybody to please fill out the most recent version of the cost share agreement form. Having an old version could result in errors that need to be corrected by you and kind of slows the process down. It will save all of us a lot of time by making sure that you use the most current version of the form. Another thing too is, especially for newbies, be sure to read the instructions and even use the checklists that are provided on the resources tab of the TRM grant website. And I also want to point out that in order to fill out and save this form electronically, it must be opened using Adobe Reader or Acrobat software. So let's dive into the cost share agreement form in a little more detail. The grant information section at the top of the form contains information required from the grantee that identifies the grantee name, the grantee's chosen CSA number, the unique grant award number that was assigned by DNR and that is listed on your grant agreement document, the grant project name, the grant program type, and the landowner information. And here's a completed example. As you can see, all of the components are filled in and the CSA number has been populated. And again, that's a number that can be chosen by you, the grantee. It's helpful when each CSA number is in chronological order for numbering purposes. One area that is sometimes not included on a completed CSA is the quote, "for more information" or call or contact section up at the top here. And what you're going to want to do is use your grantee contact information to fill out that section of the form. The property information section contains information that identifies the property title holder's information, the legal description of the property, and the site location details for BMP construction projects. And so here's a completed example. You'll notice that the legal description of the property section has both the parcel number and the legal description included. So again, according to Administrative Code Chapter NR 153.22, we want to point out that cost share agreements that have contiguous sites under the same ownership may all be included on one CSA. So in terms of page 2 of the cost share agreement, this is where the landowner and or operator is required to sign the top section of the form. While the landowner, if not the operator, they are then supposed to sign the middle portion of the form on page 2. Each signature will need to be witnessed by a notary public, and the notary will need to fill in the notary section in addition to providing their notary seal or stamp. After the landowner or operator signs, the grantee then needs to sign and have their signatures notarized as well. Remember that the grantee is the authorized government representative that is selected in the Governmental Authorizing Resolution, or GAR. We'll review the GAR in further detail along with a sample GAR in the reimbursement request section of the webinar. And as I mentioned before, here's the fine print. The terms of the cost share agreement include Section A. This is all very small. I apologize for the size of this in this slide. Section A is the general requirements. Section B is the landowner operator requirements. And Section C of the conditions is the governmental unit or grantee requirements. It's really important that you, the grantee, review these terms with the landowner and operator prior to signing the agreement. You'll notice at the bottom of the form, the fillable PDF now on the DNR website will auto-populate the CSA number and the landowner operator's name. So in the cost share agreement table, please fill out all the information that is asked for in the shaded cells. The most current version of the CSA form is dated August 2018. It added some new features, including if an error is made when selecting a BMP, you can now delete that line, and you can see the minus symbol to the left on the left-hand side of the screen, the left-hand side of the table. It also allows for the quantity of the BMP to have 2 decimal places in this column. And it also allows for the state cost share column to be manually entered rather than auto-populating, which previously caused some problems depending on how much state cost share was being provided versus other sources. So next we're going to move on to an example of the cost share agreement table that was actually completed. So in this example, you'll notice that there are 2 BMPs, R16 manure storage system and R18 nutrient management. We're going to assume that these 2 BMPs were selected in the grant application itself and are in the grant agreement. And remember that if there are additional BMPs in the grant agreement and application that are going to be completed or installed and reimbursement is being sought, they must be included in the CSA as well. The grantee can specify the estimated maximum amount of cost sharing the landowner can receive. And for example, if the CSA is for a manure storage system that will cost $350,000 to construct, and the cost share rate for this small scale trim project is 70%, that would result in a state cost share of $245,000. However, for those of you that have small scale trim grants, you know that the maximum grant award is $225,000. So in this case, in this table, the grantee would put the $225,000 as the state cost share amount instead of the $245,000. It can cause confusion in some cases because obviously the $245,000 is the 70%, but you have to make sure that the landowner is aware of the cost cap on the grant. And we want to also point out that when there's additional funding sources being used, they need to be specified on the cost share agreement. And it's important to note that federal funds can't be matched with other federal funds for a given BMP. So for projects where the source of the state share is federal Section 319 funds, the local share cannot be from another source of federal funds. And so here you see an example of the cost share agreement table that has blended funding. So you can see down at the bottom, we've identified the other programs from which cost sharing is provided, and they're listed down there. And in this case, it's EQIP funds. And as you will see in the example, the manure storage system total cost in this case is estimated to be at $260,000. The cost share rate is 70% per the grant agreement. And in this case, the 70% state share would normally be $182,000 if you take 70% of $260,000. But for the sake of this example, the project is including $150,000 of EQIP funds to help pay for the manure storage. So the state share is then reduced to the balance of the BMP cost, subtracting out the landowner share, which was 30% of $260,000, and the EQIP share, which then is a remainder of $32,000 for the DNR share. So I just want to remind everyone that if you have any trouble, trying to figure out how to fill out this table, be sure to give your regional non-point source coordinator a call, and they can help you out. The last page of the cost share agreement is essentially left available for any special conditions that you may want to include in the agreement. With the August 2018 update to the form, an initials box has been added to the bottom of the page, and it also populates the CSA number and landowner and operator's name at the bottom of that page. So just want to provide some additional helpful hints, kind of reiterate some of the things that I've covered already. Be sure to download the most current form from the TRM Grant website. Make sure that you record the CSA with the Register of Deeds if the total cost share agreement amount exceeds $14,000. Be sure that that cost share agreement is signed by the governmental authorized representative. And be sure to seek pre-approval from the DNR non-point source coordinator when the state share amount exceeds $50,000. And be sure to do this and seek this approval prior to getting the landowner or operator to sign the cost share agreement. So I'll pause here. This concludes the first portion of the webinar. So if anybody has any questions, we'll take some questions.
We don't have any in the system at the moment.
Okay, all right. So we will move along then. So now we're at part 3, and we're going to cover the reimbursement request. So we'll provide a review of the procedures on how to fill out the reimbursement request form, which is DNR Form 8700-336. And we'll walk through some examples and provide some helpful hints. So why is it important to fill out the RFR reimbursement request form completely? I think the most important reason is that the information that we're collecting on this form essentially helps document how the state and federal funds are used. We need a complete and accurate reimbursement request form in order to kind of fulfill the obligation of showing how the funding is being used in the program. When can a reimbursement request be sought? Well, I think it's important in the TRM Grant program to know that for best management practice implementation, reimbursement can only be sought once a BMP has been fully installed or implemented. So you have to wait until at least one BMP has been fully implemented before you seek reimbursement. If you have a cost share agreement and you're working with a landowner and that cost share agreement has 4 practices on it, and the landowner has gone forth and actually installed 2 of the 4 practices, you as the grantee could seek a partial reimbursement on the 2 practices that have been installed, but they need to be fully installed in order to do that. And then they could come in later with a final reimbursement request for the remaining 2 that subsequently get installed. The final request for reimbursement must be submitted within 60 days of the end of the grant period, which is usually about March 1st of the year following the grant expiration in most cases. So again, I mentioned earlier that the recording fees are eligible for reimbursement. The grantee needs to use BMP code R115 when submitting the reimbursement request in tables 1 and 2 of the RFR. And just want to point out too that state and local administrative permit fees, attorney's fees, environmental cleanup costs, brokerage fees paid by the buyer, and real estate transfer taxes are not reimbursable costs. So for those of you that have a large-scale TRM grant, some of you will have requested and had local assistance funds awarded in your grant. And a reminder here that the local assistance grant portion of your grant award is that agreement between us, DNR, and you, the grantee, and we're providing funds to you for staffing activities to carry out the tasks identified in your project. At this time, only large-scale TRM grantees are eligible for the local assistance awards, and you must specify that in your grant, which I believe for both of our large-scale TRM grant awards this year, that was the case. So for the current set of 2020 grant awards, the local assistance cap was set at 10% of the grant amount allocated for the BMP installations. The eligible costs for local assistance are listed in NR 153-16 sub 1 of the administrative code. And it's essentially a list of things, again, that are staffing activities to carry out your project. For those of you that have a local assistance award, it is a separate budget line item in your grant agreement. And in seeking reimbursement for local assistance expenses, those expenses are reimbursed at a rate of 70%, similar to the BMP cost share rate. I want to point out too, for those of you that may have attended the TRM grant application webinar yesterday, you may have heard through the grapevine that we, in the next set of grant applications, we have increased the local assistance cap to 40% of the grant amount allocated to BMPs. Some of the new grant awardees have asked the question, could they be awarded and kind of grandfathered in for that grant cap, that increasing grant cap? That is something that we have not yet made a decision on, but we are looking at available funds for the next grant cycle and factoring that in. But I will be in touch with you if we are able to increase your local assistance cap. I will be in touch with you regarding that. And again, we have not made a decision on whether or not we will be able to grandfather in existing large-scale TRM grants for that higher cap, but stay tuned. So now I'm going to focus on force account and how it differs then from the local assistance award. So for force account work, this refers to the use of the grantee's own employees or equipment for project planning, design, construction, construction-related activities, inspection, repair, or improvement to a given BMP. Only small-scale TRM applicants may apply for force account. And that amount is capped at 5% of the amount reimbursed for BMPs. Force account expenses may only be reimbursed with the final grant settlement. So here too, you the county had to have requested force account as part of your grant application, and it had to have been approved essentially via the grant award in order for it to be an eligible cost in your grant. But it is a separate budget line item. For those of you that had it approved in your grant award, it's a separate budget line item eligible for reimbursement. Something that's becoming increasingly important are the economic hardship provisions in NR 153. Grantees in certain situations may exceed the cost share limits, cost share percentages identified in NR 154. If the landowner or operator that's going to provide the local share of the project costs meets the economic hardship requirements in NR 154.03 sub 3. The economic hardship affidavit and notification of determination forms are required to be submitted, along with a statement acknowledging economic hardship from the landowner's CPA or financial institution. And Section C of the economic hardship form, which is provided on DNR's website, shows all of the items that need to be submitted to the DNR. And if you're unsure of how to complete the economic hardship paperwork, please don't hesitate to contact your regional non-point source coordinator to assist you. So we're going to dive in a little bit more into the details of how to complete the reimbursement form. Probably one of the most critical parts of your grant implementation is actually seeking reimbursement for the grant funding. Just want to point out that the most current version of the form is always listed on the TRM grant website, and you can download that form as necessary for each of your reimbursement requests. And there's also instruction forms and a grantee checklist that may provide good reminders of how to complete and submit your request. So let's dive into the details of the reimbursement form. The grantee or grant information section contains information required from you, the grantee, that identifies the grantee name, the address to which the reimbursement checks should be mailed, the grantee the grant project name, the state cost share rate, grant program type, and the unique grant award number assigned by the DNR listed on the grant agreement. The grantee must also indicate whether the RFR is a partial or final request and the time period covered by the request. For final requests, the grantee must complete and submit a final report form, which must be approved by the DNR Regional Non-Point Source Coordinator before the final reimbursement is processed. And that final report form too will be covered later in the webinar and is available on the DNR website. So a couple of helpful hints to remember as you fill out the reimbursement form. Again, download the most current version of the form. And when entering the state cost share rate, be sure to take the rate that is actually listed from your grant agreement. It's important that we have consistency from the grant award document to the cost share agreement to the reimbursement form in all steps of the process, that cost share rate is consistent. And when supplying the grant information, use the information from the grant application or the grant award or the contact page for the mail check to section. This needs to match what was previously provided to the DNR by the grantee. For the period covered by the request, it must be within the grant period. I'm a little ahead of myself, or actually a little behind in my clicking here, excuse me. For the period covered by the request, it must be within the grant period and within the date range of the invoices. If an invoice is dated, for example, January 15th, 2022, because this is when the contractor invoiced the grantee and it's outside of the grant period, that's okay, as long as the work was provided during the grant period, and most of our grants end at the end of a calendar year, and that date is listed on the invoice or proof of purchase documentation. So for the payment information section on page 1 of the reimbursement form, and this is in the middle of page 1, you need to provide us, this section essentially provides a summary of the current payment record and grant balance. The grant financial data includes the grant total award, payments the grantee has received to date, and grant funds remaining. The blue highlighted lines are where the grantee must enter the grant award amount listed on the grant agreement and total prior reimbursement amounts. The cell containing the reimbursement request total is auto-populated on page 2 of, from table 1 on page 2 of the form and cannot be overwritten. The grant balance remaining amount is auto-populated and calculated based on amounts entered above. The highlighted yellow cells in the right-hand column are for DNR use only, and I would ask that you leave those sections blank. Now on to the certification section on page 1. This section is required to be completed by the grantee's authorized representative, certifying that the information contained in the form and the supporting documentation is true and correct. Again, the authorized government official must sign or type their name in the space provided. And if the name of the official is typed rather than signed, the official must personally email the completed reimbursement form and supporting documentation to the regional non-point source coordinator. The authorized representative's job title and contact information must also be provided, as well as the date the reimbursement is submitted to DNR. The section for CFA comments is for DNR use only, and that section too must be left blank. So to authorize a grantee or governmental authorized representative, the authorizing resolution or government responsibility resolution needs to be completed, approved, and adopted by the full board. In the case of the county, there'd be the full county board, since the board has the authority to enter into agreements with the DNR and approve the authority of county committees. And this needs to be done prior to reimbursement being paid. I think all of the 2020 grant awardees for TRM grants already have their authorizing resolution in, which is great. Just note, for future reference, if you haven't done this already, that it is preferred and highly recommended that the position title of the authorized representative is listed and not their name, due to staff changes that can happen within the municipality. The position title must be the person that certifies the RFR ultimately, in the case of the authorized representative for the RFR. There is a Word doc example available on the TRM grant website under the resources tab towards the bottom for an example of the authorizing resolution. And using that sample will ensure that all components of the resolution are included when submitted to DNR. So moving along to page 2 of the reimbursement request, you'll see tables 1 and 2. And the next several slides are going to go through what is needed in these tables to ensure that you have an accurate and can do a timely reimbursement for your project. So looking first at table 1, for each grant eligible BMP for which reimbursement is requested, the following information must be provided, going from left to right across the table. The name of the cost share recipient, the DNR BMP code, which is selected from the drop-down list, the BMP that was installed, the number of units installed, the total BMP expense amount, the reimbursement amount that is being requested from DNR, and whether or not that BMP or activity was completed in its entirety, yes or no. And just a reminder again that in order to be reimbursed in the TRM program, a BMP does in fact need to be completed in order to be reimbursed. So looking at an example of a partially completed table 1, the first step is to enter the name of the cost share recipient. Then you select the applicable BMP code. You'll find eligible BMPs for your project again in your grant agreement. A grant amendment should be sought if additional BMPs are needed, and this should be done prior to seeking reimbursement. Grant amendments will be covered a little bit later in the webinar, but as always, please contact your regional Nonpoint coordinator with questions. So we'll provide some tips for success to take note of in filling out Table 1. First, there needs to be a row in Table 1 for each BMP for which reimbursement is being requested. Second, BMPs can't be combined in one row. They must be separated out. So you can see in this example, you wouldn't be able to put the full $342,000 worth of cost for the two BMPs in the R16 row. They need to be separated out. Third, the reimbursement request column must specify the amount of reimbursement being sought. And next, when writing the BMP names, I just want to point out that writing the BMP names or codes on the invoices is really helpful to be able to clearly delineate what is being sought on each invoice, and when reviewing the invoices and tying the BMP to the invoice. So when the reimbursement is being processed, there's no confusion as to which invoice goes to which BMP. And if only a portion of a particular invoice is being sought for reimbursement, it's really helpful to parse out those amounts in a separate spreadsheet, so we can distinguish between what is actually needing reimbursement versus what is not applicable to the reimbursement request. It's very helpful to do that. So moving on to Table 2 of the reimbursement form, this is where each proof of purchase, which is usually an invoice, needs to be entered for each BMP. So additional rows can be added in this table by selecting the plus sign over on the right-hand side. So going through the form here, you can see that all sections in Table 2 must be filled in. The document number is the invoice number. So if there's no invoice, please use the date of that document. The BMP code must be selected from the drop-down, and the lines in Table 2 for that BMP should total that same BMP in Table 1. So you can see the document number again is that green cell, is where you would put the document number. The yellow cells are the BMP codes. The purple cells are the DNR funding amount. That is the amount that is actually being requested by DNR. And then the blue cells are the non-DNR funding amount. That's the remainder of the expense that DNR is not funding. The pink cells on the table are the non-DNR funding source. So if it's not the DNR paying for it, what is the actual source of funding? Where is it coming from? In many cases, this could be the landowner, could be other funding sources such as other grant programs. So for Table 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about the reimbursement documentation. Proofs of purchase are required for all, excuse me, I'm going to go back up one slide. Proofs of purchase are required for all state cost share amounts to be reimbursed. Those could be bids, accepted estimates, invoices, work orders, or contractual agreements. If one proof of purchase order contains costs for multiple BMPs, the proof of purchase should be listed multiple times for each BMP. This allows for expenses documented in the proof of purchase to be reconciled with expenses in Table 1 for each BMP. All right, moving on now to Table 2, so the reimbursement documentation. The total amounts of DNR and non-DNR funding, as well as the grand total amount, are calculated and auto-populated at the bottom of Table 2. The proof of purchase documentation amounts in Table 2 should be reconciled with the costs claimed in Table 1. So to break this down a little bit further, you can see that the proof of purchase grand total amount in Table 2 should equal the BMP expenses claimed in Table 1, as noted in the yellow circles. The total DNR funding amount in Table 2 should equal the total reimbursement request in Table 1, as noted with the blue circles. And so here you see an example of Table 1 and Table 2 that have been filled out. In Table 1, each BMP listed must have associated invoices in Table 2. So you can see that BMP R16 in the pink cells in Table 1 has associated invoices in Table 2 with the associated pink cells. In Table 2, the BMP code needs to be selected for each proof of purchase. So you can see both in Table 1 and in Table 2, both R16 and R33 are listed. And again, in Table 2, remember that each applicable invoice or proof of purchase needs to be a separate line in Table 2 for each BMP. All right, so we're going to focus a little bit more on local assistance for those of you that have large-scale TRM grants. As I mentioned before, local assistance is an eligible cost for large-scale TRM grantees, and it should be included as a function or a portion of your grant in order to be eligible. Local assistance needs to be listed as a separate BMP code in Table 1, and that BMP code is R53. So for large-scale TRM projects, again, the current grant cap is 10% of the grant amount allocated to BMP implementation. Eligible local assistance costs for the TRM grantees are provided in NR 153, which would be a good reference, NR 153-16. The maximum state cost share rate for local assistance expenses is 70%, similar to BMP expenses. And the local assistance certification form that you see here on the screen, DNR Form 8700-354, can be found on the TRM grant website under the Reimbursements tab. The local assistance form is a record of essentially the county employees' labor on the project. So you'll start by filling out Section A, which is the grant partner information, and you'll select the local assistance labor worksheet. Then you'll skip Section B and fill out the worksheet on the second page in Section C. After doing so, Section B will automatically populate. And as with most DNR forms in the grant process, the authorized representative will then need to sign pages 1 and 2, which certifies the information provided is accurate and true. And then remember to also list the total local assistance cost in Table 1 of the RFR form as BMP code R53. So in this example, the total cost for local assistance would be $976.50, and the 70% cost share rate applied to that would lead to a total of $683.55 for reimbursement. You can see that down here, kind of in small print on the screen. Okay, now moving on to a force account example for those of you that have small scale TRM grants and have force account listed as a budget line item in your grant. The BMP code that you're going to use in table 1 of the reimbursement form is BMP code R54. And again, force account may not exceed 5% of the total project reimbursement when bond funds are used. In the case of, I think, all of our small scale TRM projects, all of your grants are funded with bond revenue. And force account expenses may only be reimbursed with your final reimbursement request. And the force account form is 8700-353, and this too can be found on the TRM grant website under the reimbursements tab. And it too is a record of the county employees' labor associated with the BMP implementation. So with this form, you'll start by filling out the top section A, the grant partner information, and select the force account labor worksheet. Then you skip section B and fill out the worksheet on the second page in section C. Again, in doing so, section B will automatically populate. And here too, you want the authorized representative to sign pages 1 and 2, which certifies the information provided is accurate and true. So again, remember to list your force account cost in table 1 of the reimbursement form as BMP code R54. In this case, in this example, we have a total cost of $540. Applying the 70% cost share rate would be a total reimbursement cost potential of $378. And the last section of the reimbursement request form is the project status and the project installation verification sections. The project status box needs to be completed if a partial reimbursement request is being submitted. And for each partial reimbursement request, a progress report needs to be included. Essentially what we're getting at here is the project still on track or not? The project installation verification section needs to be populated with the grantee and contact person's information. The certification checkbox needs to be reviewed and then selected to certify that the project and the BMPs have been installed in accordance with the appropriate standards and specifications. And last but not least, the last section is filled out by your regional non-point source coordinator as they've reviewed the form. So some of you have received federal Section 319 funds as a portion of your grant award. And this form applies to those of you that did receive the federal funds. To ensure that the department is in compliance with uniform guidance, the Grant Partner Financial Data Report Form 9300-230, needs to be completed for every reimbursement when federal funds have been awarded. Then the DNR can accurately report to the feds the non-state funds that were used as match to the grant you received, including cash contributions from your organization, force account labor, and donated labor, supplies, equipment, or equipment usage. And I just want to point out too, annually in January, I'll be sending a letter to grantees who have received federal funds, specifying the amount of federal and state reimbursements for the previous year. This will help you help the grantees that have received these federal funds to know how much funds were reimbursed in the previous year, and pardon me, I assume I lost my place here. The grantees, it'll help the grantees that need to have a single tax audit completed. That is one of the requirements associated with receiving the federal funds. And also an important requirement associated with the federal funding is that all non-federal entities that receive federal and Wisconsin funds totaling at least $750,000 in a given calendar year are required to hire a skilled auditor and to evaluate the compliance with the Single Audit Act as amended and uniform guidance. So at this point, I'll pause again if anybody has any questions before we move on to the next section.
And we do not have any questions at the moment.
All right. Okay, we will move on to the amendment and variance section of the webinar. It seems that in most cases, no matter how much we plan, things can change during the grant period, and sometimes an amendment or a variance is necessary to make adjustments to your project. So we'll start first with grant amendments. What is an amendment? Ultimately, it's a change to one or more of the conditions in your grant agreement. And when should you, the grantee, actually request an amendment? Definitely before the end of your grant period. You definitely want to have an amendment if it's needed, taken care of before your grant actually expires. And you'd want to do it before taking any action or incurring any kind of project cost that is inconsistent with your current grant award, such as incurring project costs that are ineligible for cost sharing under the grant agreement or in excess of the cost shareable amount for any budget line item that is in the grant award document. You'd want to seek an amendment for adding, replacing, or eliminating a BMP included in the grant agreement. And also when you're changing the location of a practice in the grant agreement or the location of your project area, an amendment would be needed. So we'll just dive in a little bit more to the actual types of grant amendments. The first and most common type is a time amendment. Grant extensions, grant time extension amendments, extends the length of a grant period. NR 153 establishes that grant projects are 2 years for small scale projects and 3 years for large scale projects, with a possible 1-year extension. Extending the grant period requires an amendment. The next category of an amendment is a budget amendment. If a grantee wants to increase the state share amount of one or more budget lines in the grant, this is a budget amendment. In many cases, a budget amendment doesn't change the total award amount, but instead shifts money from one budget line to another within the grant agreement. For example, if an award includes $125,000 for BMP construction and $25,000 for engineering, and the grantee spends less than expected on construction and more than expected on engineering and wants to get reimbursed their full award amount, they would need an amendment to shift funds from construction to the engineering budget line of the grant agreement. The next type of amendment is a scope amendment. This type of amendment is required if the grantee changes the type of BMP that is being constructed or the location where it will be constructed. A scope amendment is also required if the grantee proposes to add or eliminate a BMP from the grant agreement. And sometimes there's other issues that come up that will require a change to the grant agreement conditions. For example, if it's determined that the landowner meets the criteria for economic hardship after the fact of the grant award, the grant agreement would need to be amended to change the cost share rate. Keep in mind that any change in grant conditions requires an amendment, even if it doesn't fall into the category of time, budget, or scope amendment. It is still required, and you should talk to your regional non-point source coordinator about any changes. Also, keep in mind that your grant application is incorporated into your grant agreement by reference. So a change to the project described in your application may also require an amendment. So the amendment request form, again, is available on the DNR website for the TRM grant program. And the amendment request form shown in this slide asks questions about the proposed changes to the project in parts A and B. Then, based on the answers selected by the grantee in parts A and B, the form will tell the grantee whether a budget, scope, or extension amendment is required. So on this slide, you can see that the grantee has filled in parts A and B, and part C tells the grantee that based on their answers, that yes, an extension amendment and scope amendment are both required. So based on the type of amendment needed, subsequent questions will appear for the grantee to answer. Keep in mind that there's always circumstances that we cannot anticipate and cover in the form. So if something in your grant project is changing and you wonder whether an amendment is required, even if no yes appears on the form when you fill out parts A and B, I think it's still really good for you to contact your regional Nonpoint coordinator and talk to them about the changes to your project. Once complete, the grantee should submit the form to the coordinator, who will then review it and forward it to DNR's Nonpoint Source Grants team. If the amendment is approved by the grants team, I will then issue the amendment as the grant manager. Extension amendments are usually a letter from the DNR notifying the grantee of the extension. Other amendments require that the grantee sign and return a grant amendment document to the DNR. Okay, moving on to variances. So, the amendment is one kind of change to your grant agreement. A variance will ultimately result in another kind of change to your grant agreement. So what happens ultimately if something in your project is needed to change, but it is prohibited by the administrative codes that apply to the TRM grant program, both NR 153 and 154. Another way to say this would be, is it something that would require DNR to make an exception ultimately to the code? The DNR does have the ability to allow exceptions to be made when certain conditions are met. NR 153 does allow for variances, and that's essentially what a variance is. So I think it's really important to point out that in certain cases, variances are not allowed. If there's something that is actually specified in state statutes, DNR may not grant a variance for anything that is listed in Wisconsin state statutes. One of the most common types of variance requests that we receive ultimately is to extend the length of the grant period beyond the maximum allowed in administrative code. So there's various conditions specified in NR 153.31 that allows DNR to approve a variance from a requirement in NR 153 if all of the following things are met. So for the grantee, they need to submit a written request to DNR requesting the variance, citing the specific subchapter of code, section, essentially from which the variance is requested. They should also clearly explain the circumstances justifying the variance in that written request, addressing factors such as good cause, circumstances beyond the control of the grantee, and or financial hardship. DNR then, once that request is received, will review it to determine, based on what you provide, whether the variance is essential to affect the necessary grant actions and the water quality objectives of the project, and or look at if there's special circumstances that make the variance essentially in the best interest of the program. If approved, I would then process the variance request essentially as a grant amendment. So here's some sample language, recommended language for requesting a variance. You can see in the color highlighted sections where the grantee would fill in some information, and the rest is largely boilerplate language. You can see in an actual filled out example here, the corresponding content that the grantee would supply versus boilerplate language. And note that you can see the justification for the request addresses factors such as good cause and circumstances beyond the control of the grantee. So let's review how you, the grantee, will know and if and when your variance request has been approved and is in effect. Although you will submit your request to your DNR Regional Non-Point Source Coordinator, and they will recommend approval or disapproval, it's only the Director of the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance that can approve a variance. So sometimes this can be confused. Sometimes grantees will confuse an email from their regional staff recommending approval as the approval, but that actually is not the case. So until you see a letter that looks like this one, your variance has not been approved. So you need a variance approval letter on DNR letterhead, and that has been signed by the Director of the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance, and they must have that person's signature to be valid. So we're now at the last section of the webinar, which covers the final report and the letter of compliance. But I'll pause here just to see if we have any questions.
We do not have any questions.
Okay, we'll just keep chugging right along here. Okay, moving on. So as you get to the end of your project, it's going to be important that you complete the final report form. That too is provided on the DNR website. And a final report form must be filled in and completed and submitted ultimately with the final reimbursement request for all TRM grant projects. The final report form and that final RFR, again, must be submitted within 60 days of the end of the grant period, which in most cases is right around March 1st after your grant expires. And I want to point out too that since many of you won't be submitting your final report form for another couple of years, I want to mention that we are working on developing an easier way to provide your final report information. Some of you may have heard that we are in the process of developing a BMP implementation tracking system, commonly referred to as BITS. And we are in the process of essentially incorporating the content of the final report form into the tracking system. So it would be a web-based way of providing your final report content to DNR rather than filling out a PDF form. And it's very possible that the new tracking system will be up and running by the time your final report form needs to be submitted for your project. So we'll be in touch with you about that. We're actually in the process of doing an early round of external testing for the final report portion of the tracking system. And you may actually be seeing emails in the near future with additional requests to test the form and that portion of the tracking system. But for now, we expect that you will use the fillable PDF form that again is on the DNR website. And we'll go through how to fill out that form today in the webinar. So essentially, what are we looking for in the final report form? What kind of information is collected? We are looking for what BMPs were constructed or implemented, what pollutants were reduced by those installed practices, if there were NO 151 agricultural performance standards and prohibitions brought into compliance, what were they, and or possibly what TMDL implementation goals were achieved. Was ultimately the project implemented according to the grant agreement and any subsequent amendments? And then is the project consistent with the various statutes and rules and funding requirements? So really you're telling the story of how the project and what was implemented. And as usual, the final report form is available on the DNR website, both the final report form and the instructions for the form under the resources tab. And we just ask that you do read the instructions and you fill out your form completely. We'll dive into the details of the form. So the sections at the beginning of the form and the end of the form only need to be filled out once. The other sections of the form will need to be filled out for each site included in the project. So you can see here in the grant information section, you're going to first start out by filling out and selecting from the drop down what is the grant type that you have for your project. And then in the grant information section, you're going to provide the basic information regarding your project. Who you are, the grant number, the project name, and project contact information. So for the next parts of the report that are shown in this slide, you are going to be required to enter this information specific to each project site location in your project. So project site generally corresponds to the property covered by a cost share agreement. So, you know, as an example, if your project only has one best management practice that was installed, you very likely only have one cost share agreement then associated with that practice, and therefore one project site location that would need to be entered in the final report form once. You know, however, you know, if your project has more than one BMP, you may have more than one project site. If you had more than one cost share agreement for your project, you definitely will have more than one project site location and would need to fill out the site location information for each individual site for your project. This is often the case for large-scale projects, large-scale trim projects. And we'll show you how to fill out the sections for each site. But we would ask then, even if you have multiple sections or multiple sites for your project, that you only fill out one final report form for the entire trim grant. So let's zoom in a little bit and look more closely at that site location information. Most of it's self-explanatory, but I just do want to point out a couple things that we often get asked about. For those of you that, you know, in filling out your grant application, you may remember being asked to tell us what the nearest receiving water body is. That is the nearest water body, stream, river, or lake that is in closest proximity to your project location. And also, the primary water body addressed by the project, again, is that water body for which credit was taken in the water quality needs section of the grant application. So your nearest water body may be a smaller tributary stream that leads to the primary water body that, as an example, may be an impaired water for which you receive points in the water quality needs section of your grant application. And then once you select your 12-digit HUC, hydrologic unit code, the name of that HUC will be automatically populated in the watershed name cell. So in the next section of the form, you're going to select the BMP or BMPs that were installed as part of the project at that particular site. So you're going to select all of the water quality BMPs installed at that project at that site. And there should only be one BMP type listed per row. You can add additional rows for adding then additional BMPs at that particular site. Each BMP for your project must either bring an existing non-compliant facility into compliance with one or more of the ag performance standards or prohibitions, and or implement the pollutant-specific goals or recommendations of an EPA-approved TMDL. You all know that you're either in the TMDL project category or the non-TMDL project category. And so the follow-through here is to tell us the story of how you met the performance standards and or implemented a TMDL. Grantees are required to select at least one of these for each BMP and may select more than one for a given BMP in terms of the list of applicable performance standards. And you'll notice at the end of the drop-down list, you do have the option to select not applicable TMDL implementation, and only if the project is a TMDL trim project that implements the goals and recommendations of an EPA-approved TMDL, and the project did not bring a performance standard or prohibition into compliance. In many cases, a project will do both. So it'll bring a performance standard or prohibition into compliance and implement a TMDL. In those cases, please select the performance standard or prohibition that applies in that case. So after you've selected the BMPs installed by the project and the performance standards addressed by the project, you'll want to move on to filling out information about the BMPs that were installed, including the pollutant load reductions achieved. Completion of this part of the form is required. It is not optional. And this is actually a common reason for a delayed reimbursement request, is that we have to send final reports back because the grantee did not fill in the pollutant load reduction information. Really, this is one of the most important pieces of information that we get from the final report, because it is one of the main ways that we are able to evaluate the project success and overall program success for all the cost sharing funds that are provided via the grants. In a lot of cases too, we're required to provide pollutant load reduction information as a function of both state and federal reporting. So it's really critical that we get pollutant load reduction amounts in the final report. So as you can see, the form has a space to report sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen load reductions. You're only required to report the load reduction for the pollutants addressed by the project. You know, in many cases, when you filled in the grant application, you identified the pollutants that were going to be addressed by the project. Although you are welcome to fill in all of the columns. In some cases, you're going to have a practice that's going to address both phosphorus and sediment, as an example. So please do report the load reductions that minimally are addressed by the project. So after you've entered those load reductions, please indicate the model or method that was used to calculate the pollutant load reduction. And then ultimately, please provide the total cost of the BMP as opposed to the state share or local share. Provide the total cost of the BMP that was installed or constructed. And just to point out, if the BMP was part of a larger project, please focus in on the cost of the actual BMP that was funded with the TRIM grant, as opposed to the larger project costs. So you'll note then under the BMP table in the site information section, column 1 of the compliance requirements section of the form will automatically populate with the performance standard or prohibition addressed by the site or addressed by the project based on what you selected in the preceding section, as you can see in this example. And so for each performance standard and prohibition addressed by the project and listed in the table, please fill in the columns then to the right. If cost sharing for the project was offered under a formal notice pursuant to NR 151 or NR 243, select the notice type from the drop-down menu in the second column. If cost sharing for the project was offered under a formal notice pursuant to NR 151 or 243, then please attach the notice to the final report form and submit it with the final report form, and then select the yes column in, or the yes drop down in column 3 to indicate that the notice is attached. So continuing to the right then, if the performance standard in column 1 was brought into compliance by the project, select yes in the 4th column. For non-TMDL trim projects, the applicant must be able to select yes in the 4th column. BMPs installed under a non-TMDL trim project to address a performance standard or prohibition for which compliance was not achieved are ineligible for reimbursement. And then in the last column, select yes to indicate that the required compliance letter is attached. So in the next section of the site location portion of the final report form, you'll see a section that provides a checklist that you can use to confirm that your compliance letter meets all of the necessary requirements. So you're going to want to be able to check the true statements regarding the compliance letter that you attached. So first, you're going to want to check the box 1 if the copy of the compliance letter for the site has been placed in the county files. Secondly, you're going to want to check box 2A if the compliance letter for the site has been provided by the county to the landowner and the cost share recipient. And then check box 2B if the letter identifies each of the performance standards and prohibitions on cropland and livestock facilities brought into compliance by the project. Check box 2C if the letter identifies the name and location of the facility where compliance has been achieved. And finally, check box 2D if the letter states that the landowner is obligated to maintain compliance with each performance standard and prohibition addressed by the project in perpetuity, regardless of cost sharing. And just to illustrate what is an acceptable compliance letter, we have an example here, an example of a compliance letter that meets all of those requirements that I just mentioned in the final report form. We'll go through this a little bit in more detail. So as you can see in the top half of the letter, it identifies the performance standards and prohibitions brought into compliance by the project. In this case, it was process wastewater handling, clean water diversions, and the prohibition of direct runoff from stored manure to waters of the state. And the compliance letter identifies the name and the location of the facility where compliance has been achieved. The bottom half of the letter includes the required statements stating that the landowner is required to maintain compliance with each of the performance standards and prohibitions addressed by the project in perpetuity, regardless of future cost sharing. So in the next part of the final report form, the grantee is required to check boxes indicating that the required attachments for each site are attached to the form. We're looking for pre and post photos for the BMPs that were installed, an aerial photo map of the site with the BMPs labeled, the load reduction modeling documentation, and in cases where water quality monitoring was defined as a way to evaluate the project, if it's applicable to your project, the water quality monitoring results in summary. And there is a space on the final report form to provide some narrative where you can add any other important information about the site that wasn't previously asked for. And then if the project does include more than one site, you can click the add location button, the plus location button, over to the right-hand side. And so when you click that button, a blank copy of all of the sections that we just discussed will appear for you to enter information for the additional sites. Again, I want to point out that grantees should not submit more than one final report for their project. You can include all of your large-scale trim sites on the same form. We're not going to accept multiple final reports for a single project because it just makes it really hard to keep track then of all the various information associated with your one project. And last but not least in the final report form is the grantee certification section. You'll only need to complete this part of the form once. And in this section, you need to type the name and title of the authorized government official, and then have that person email the form directly to the regional non-point source coordinator. This form does not require a signature. And I just want to wrap up the webinar by reminding you all again who your regional non-point source coordinator is. Please take note based on your county location. I'm sure all of you are probably already familiar with that, but if you have any new staff participating in the webinar today, just a helpful reminder. And so with that, that concludes the presentation, and I'll open it up again for questions.
We do not have any questions entered at this time.
Okay. Keep in mind, if any of you have questions about the administration of your grant, obviously after the webinar, feel free to ask your regional non-point source coordinator, but my contact information is also listed here on the slide, so feel free to give me a call.
All right. Well, thank you, Corinne. That was a lot of great information. And again, this was recorded and we will be sharing it via a YouTube link in the coming days. So keep an eye out for that if you need to circle back and reference any of the information that Corinne went over. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.